Of all the iconic horror movie villains, Michael Myers is probably the most enigmatic. Freddy Krueger taunts his victims and has a pretty straightforward psychological makeup. Jason Voorhees is treated as little more than a hulking monstrosity with a cool mask. But there was something different about Michael Myers, something mysterious, elusive. At least in the first film, which forms the basis of my analysis. The first film seemed to have a very specific agenda with Myers that the sequels didn't seem all that interested in. John Carpenter's film was a major precursor to what would become the de facto rule set for slasher films going forward. Don't have sex, don't drink or do drugs, don't go in that room, and so on and so forth. The standout of these rules is, of course, the final girl, the lone heroine who is the only survivor among the group of friends who were ceremoniously killed off one by one. While some of these rules were explored in earlier horror films, Carpenter's film was the one that synthesized these rules into a cohesive roadmap for horror filmmakers going forward. But why are these rules so important, especially in the case of Halloween? They were obviously so powerful that they warranted being recycled for a slew of horror films that followed. One could argue that this was done purely for the convenience of being able to make money by following a formula that was successful. But Carpenter's film was so wildly successful because it created these rules. They are embedded into the film's DNA, so they obviously had a huge effect on the audience. I would argue that it wasn't just the rules, but Myers' presence, which made the rules necessary to begin with. These rules have a very specific undercurrent of anxiety and fear, and suggest a kind of moral panic. What is the origin of this panic, and why was it so essential to the success of Halloween? The film was released in 1978, and the 70s was a decade coming off the social upheaval of the 1960s, and continued mistrust in American institutions. The Vietnam War, Watergate, the Manson murders, the Kent State shootings. The country was being rocked by scandals left and right, all of which shattered the idealism and serenity of the 1950s. That was a decade that seemed to promise safety and stability and abundance, but was soon completely undone by cultural revolution and karmic debt. The country had unfinished business that it failed to acknowledge with its racist history, and one could argue that this moral panic was a creeping sense of guilt over the sins of the past. One of the most striking things about Halloween is in its setup. Carpenter is careful to create an atmosphere of normalcy and security in the long, gliding Steadicam shots through the suburban neighborhoods of Haddonfield. It is very reminiscent of the idealized 1950s with its quiet, safe, and inviting suburban surroundings. This is the environment that will be shattered by Michael Myers, much like the 50s were shattered by their own cultural disruptors. A preview of this is shown in the opening sequence, where a young couple is being stalked as they participate in a nightly sexual encounter. The big reveal, of course, is that the killer is only a child, the woman's younger brother, in fact, Michael Myers. There are some key components in this reveal that are very important. The fact that the killer is a child is very unusual. He has a blank expression and almost doesn't seem to know what he's doing or where he is. This expression suggests that the boy is under the control of some nefarious force. Of course, the movie never expands on this and only hints at the evil that lies behind Michael's eyes. But this opening immediately hints that whatever is going around and killing people later in the film is less human and more of an abstract force. Carpenter deliberately removes any humanity from the killer in order to create an atmosphere of dread and uncertainty. People can be reasoned with. There is always the possibility of redemption. But if there is nothing behind the eyes, what possibility is there of hope? You can't reason with someone that has no humanity. This subconsciously implants a sense of dread in the audience. The fact that Michael never speaks also supports this idea of a lack of humanity, and Carpenter originally referred to Myers as the Shape in his script, and you can see this moniker in the closing credits. Myers' body was merely a vessel for whatever force was driving him, but he's clearly human, as we see in the opening. He's not necessarily crazy, since crazy people's actions don't make sense. Everything Myers does in the movie has a purpose, and is thoughtfully and tactically laid out in full. Myers is actually presented as extremely clever and resourceful. I suppose you can be smart and still be insane, but unlike, say, Hannibal Lecter. Myers never does anything for show and never seems to derive pleasure from his actions. His methods are straightforward and unambiguous. Jason Voorhees is presented as someone merely looking for revenge over the death of his mother, and the fact that he was teased as a little boy. His drive has some sort of emotional foundation, and that makes him squarely human, at least initially. In Halloween, Myers isn't anything. He has no moral or emotional foundation. He has no personality to speak of. He has no desire other than to kill. He is quite literally personified as the embodiment of wrath itself. But why? In order to understand this, we must first take into account what the little boy Tommy keeps reiterating to those who won't listen: the concept of the boogeyman. The boogeyman is a cultural staple used by parents who want to frighten their children into behaving themselves. The boogeyman has no specific physical appearance. It is just a concept, and that's what makes it scary. The active imagination of children does all the work in conjuring up terrifying ideas of this boogeyman. Tommy refers to Myers as the boogeyman, and it is this boogeyman that is there to punish him for being bad. This thematic idea of punishment is what is most interesting about Carpenter's film. As I mentioned before about the rules of slasher films, those rules seem to center around transgressions made by young people who are naive and ignorant of the past in which they've benefited and others have suffered. In this way, Myers acts as a kind of karmic force of retribution that is here to wreak havoc on the lives of not only the young people in the film, but their parents who will have to endure the loss of their children. There are several instances in which Myers is presented as this karmic force. He can seemingly appear and disappear at will. Carpenter's shot selection reinforces the concept of Myers as a force that looms over the entire film. Even when Myers isn't on screen, his presence is heavily suggested. Part of this is the voyeuristic aspect Carpenter employs in the opening sequence, and then modifies for use in the rest of the film. It's as if Myers is always there, lying in wait. Myers isn't just bloodthirsty, he's unstoppable. Carpenter's film was one of the first to introduce the idea of the horror movie villain that is immune to death. By now, a total cliche, but back then a pretty radical concept. There's no reasoning with him, and there's no killing him. He is inevitability itself. And the final shots of the movie, with Myers' heavy breathing over the soundtrack, create an atmosphere in which Myers is omnipresent, ready to strike at a moment's notice with little to no warning. It's a terrifying concept. All of this adds up to the overarching idea of Michael Myers as an attack on Western civilization itself. The safe, cushy, idyllic existence of the American people and their total ignorance of the terrible historical forces that form the very nation they thrive in. On a macro level, Myers could be thought of as the ugly underbelly of American society that grows through the cracks in the concrete of suburbia. What may seem like a simple horror movie is presenting concepts that go beyond mere stalking of unsuspecting teenagers and slashings with a kitchen knife. Myers is the ugly truth the citizens of Haddonfield, and by extension, the audience, don't want to acknowledge. This is part of the reason the film was so incredibly successful, and why Myers became the poster boy for the slasher villain. If you enjoyed this video, consider hitting the like and subscribe button, as I'll be posting more content in the future. Thanks for watching.